Good day, students. Today we are going to discuss about Indological studies, or Indology as it is known. This is a particular new method which had emerged in the 18th century, and after the 18th century we find it emerged in a major way as a new area of research about India in the Western academia. So, in today's lecture, we will be discussing about the concept of Indology, the way in which Indology has developed from the 18th century onwards, especially the ways in which it has emerged through phases from the 18th down till the present day, and also look at how Indological research has enlarged the sphere of studies about the Indian subcontinent. Finally, we will also look at some of the criticisms which have been leveled about Indological studies in Western academia. So, as we have stated, Indological studies is an analysis of Indic traditions about India. The Indian subcontinent is the territorial boundaries within which the studies about Indology or about India has taken place. Therefore, the analysis of ancient India, especially with a focus on historical traditions of India, is something which is studied by Indology. Indological views refer to concepts, categories, frameworks, and paradigms of knowledge which have emerged from the 18th century onwards about Indic studies, about India as a whole. And the scholars who have tried to look at Indic studies tried to have an empathetic and a sympathetic idea about Indian civilization, which they tried to enable their own research about Indian traditions. The Indologists usually refer to certain categories of texts, and this textual heritage of India, especially the Sanskrit texts as well as the Persian texts to a certain extent, form the main corpus within which Indic studies have taken place. Therefore, Indology has a very textual basis to it. The identification of such sources and the way in which research on the basis of these texts could give an idea of Indian history, its culture, its traditions, and about the social and religious aspects of India is what is covered within the aspect of Indology. Indologists also had a very deep respect for Indian culture and traditions, and therefore we find that they tried to locate notions of continuity, not just within Indian traditions, but also tried to locate the terms of continuity between Indian and other civilizations across the globe, especially between Indian and European civilizations. As a result of the Indological studies, we find a very large body of knowledge was created, and this systematic body of knowledge led to what is known as Indology or Indological studies. This kind of study prioritized the study of Indian civilization, and this priority became an endeavor not just of the colonial mindset, which began from the 18th century onwards as a result of their conquest of India, but also had an abiding interest in Indian traditions, in Indian culture and history. The Indological scholars, therefore, created a large body of knowledge, and this systematic body of knowledge is what constitutes Indological scholarship. And this systematic study of Indian civilization gave rise to a certain perspective which is known as the Indological perspective. Indology as a discipline actually consists of a melange of various kinds of disciplines. It consists of special focus on philology, on history, sociology, social and cultural anthropology, cultural studies, and also such disciplines like textual criticism and literary history and literature as a whole. However, the focus of Indological scholarship and studies is more on comparative philology and on linguistics and study of languages. Therefore, we find that the scope of this discipline is quite large. Even when it was conceived in the 18th century, it had a large scope, and this broadened even further as we move on to the 19th and the 20th century. However, we must understand that the understanding of Indian history and culture by the Indologists was actually a matured level of understanding that came as a result of various other factors which constitute a prelude to the understanding of Indian civilization. And this prelude can be located in studies about India by foreign travelers to India, right from the Hellenistic era. And also we find that various travelers who wrote travelogues on India in the ancient period in various languages, for example, in Roman as well as in Latin, we find Tacitus and Arrian and Strabo as those scholars who have written about India. We also find certain travelogues which were there in Chinese, which have been written by the Chinese travelers Fa Hien, Huensang, Yi Tsing, Ma Huan, and others. We also have, in the medieval period, various travelers traveling to India. For example, we find Ibn Battuta and Al-Biruni and others who wrote in Persian and Arabic. Therefore, this wide body of scholarship which pre-existed the 18th century and which had as its content India or India-centric analysis is a prelude to the Indological studies that we find in the modern period. However, we must also understand that the modern period tried to provide a new pattern of scholarship to Indological studies which was much more systematic than was seen in the scattered evidences in the past. Even during the Mughal period, the analysis of Bernier, Tavernier, Peter Mundy, and other such travelogues to India gave us an idea of Indian civilization and culture, but these were not systematic analysis as we find in the 18th century. So 18th century Indology is comparatively different from the type of prelude that we find in the travelogues of the earlier period. The efforts of curious travelers and also specially purposeful missionaries in the 18th century gave us another idea about Indian traditions and culture, and especially the language-based affinities that Indian languages had with European languages. For instance, we find that from the 16th and the 17th century onwards, there were a large number of people who came to India as missionaries and as travelers. For example, we can mention Thomas Stevens, who was the first European to initiate the study of Konkani as a language. We find Filippo Sassetti, an Italian, who noticed when he was in Goa in the 16th century the affinities between Italian and Sanskrit. Similarly, another Italian, Giacomo Fenicio, was one of the first who wrote a book dealing with Indian traditions, especially the Puranas. We find the German philosopher as well as a linguist who came to India, Roberto de Nobili, in the 16th century and the early 17th century, who tried to notice the importance of Buddhist literature in India. So there are several instances of such kind of studies which preceded the Indological scholarship of the 18th century. There were also various other Jesuit priests who conducted studies about India in the 17th and the 18th centuries. However, the classical Indology that we speak of in the 18th century is qualitatively different. We must understand that after the 18th century, and especially from the time of the Battle of Plassey, as the British emerged as the conquerors of India, we find that they tried to understand the manners, the customs, and the various other languages and the people of India. This abiding interest in Indian traditions was a result of an administrative necessity. They wanted to rule India through understanding its traditions. Therefore, the type of Indological scholarship which emerges in the 18th century, especially through the process of translation of Indian books into English and the establishment of institutions in various parts of India, this created the main focus of Indological studies. The 18th century created a new discovery of Indian traditions. And this discovery of Indian traditions in the 18th century was a result of the quest to understand the East. This was a part of the colonization process as well. The colonization of India and various other parts of the globe was a new feature which led the European traditions to know about India and various other parts of the globe. The focus on India was generated mainly by Europeans with an end to its own. And this end was to understand in order to rule. So therefore, there was a link between Indological scholarship, Indological studies, and the power structure of the time. In a similar manner, as Indology had emerged, we find various other types of disciplines like Egyptology, Assyriology, Sinology, Tibetology. Such traditions had also emerged in the 18th century. The idea that the Orient was different from the Occident, the West was different from the East, is something that was almost intricately connected with this process of understanding Indian cultures and traditions. In a certain manner, the Indian traditions were considered as exotic. They were considered as something which was special, which needed to be looked into. And that is why we find that Indological scholarship tried to create a basis for understanding Sanskrit and its literature. If we move on to the historical context of the 18th century, then we find that the idea that various institutions were important for understanding Indian traditions came to be built in the 18th century. Institutions, for example, the Asiatic Society, which was founded by Sir William Jones, and his associates, for example, Henry Thomas Colebrook, Nathaniel Halhed, and others, tried to create this kind of scholarship about India. We find that various translations of different kinds of studies began to take place. For instance, we may refer to the translation of the Bhagavad Gita by Charles Wilkins and the Hitopadesha by him in around 1787. In a similar manner, we find that Sir William Jones played a very critical role in translating the Gita Govinda in 1794, and we also find that the law of Manu, or the codes of Hindu law, was written by him as a part of this translation process. There were also an abiding idea that Sanskrit held the key to understanding Indian traditions. And this fixation with Sanskrit language, and to a certain extent in a later phase about Persian, was the foundation of Indological studies. If we look at the development of Indological studies, then we find that historians have analyzed it as a part of various phases. The early phase of Indological studies began in the 18th century, and it continued down till the mid-19th century. The second phase began from the mid-19th century and it continued down till the interwar period of the 20th century. And the third and the final phase began from the days of post-colonization in the mid-20th century and to the present day. If we turn back to the first phase, then we notice that Indological scholarship was not just created within India, it was also created in the West. The foundation of various Sanskrit chairs in various universities abroad was one of the concerns through which the idea of Indological scholarship was spearheaded. We find that in the 18th and especially in the early 19th century, the roots and the type of syntax and grammar of Sanskrit language and its closeness and affinity to other languages of Europe led to the idea that it was part of a common tradition of languages, a common pool of languages. And this idea of a language family, based on this particular idea, various kinds of other issues developed. One of the issues was that Indo-European or Indo-Germanic was a language pool from which Sanskrit and other European languages shared their own culture. And this idea that these belong to the same family of languages was one of the essential pillars of Indological scholarship. This was spearheaded by Sir William Jones, and later on it was taken up by various German scholars as well. We find that as a part of this idea itself, this idea of an Aryan race and the idea of an Aryan identity also emerged within Indological scholarship. Various types of institutes which were formed in various parts of the globe, especially in Europe, was critical for understanding Indological studies. We find that in France, this was spearheaded by people like Lamartine, Victor Hugo, and de Vigny. And institutions, for example, the École des Languages Orientales, was one of those critical institutions in France which tried to spearhead Indological scholarship. Later on, in 1821, the French Société Asiatique was also of importance. In England, we find that the Royal Asiatic Society of London in 1823 and also various other Sanskrit chairs which were created in European universities, especially English universities like in Oxford and later on in Cambridge, became important for this kind of scholarship that emerged. The German tradition of Indology also developed during this period. We find people like Franz Bopp, Gottfried Herder, Goethe, and August Wilhelm von Schlegel as those people who spearheaded this particular tradition in Germany. If we move on to the second stage of Indology, which began from the mid-19th century onwards, then we find that history of Indology became important for these scholars. In fact, Indology was considered to be a scientific tradition from the mid-19th century onwards. Especially the lead was taken by scholars in Germany. Historians who have studied German Indology tell us that by 1903, Germany had almost 47 professorships which looked at Indological studies, out of which almost 26 were full professors looking at Aryan studies solely. So we can understand that the German inquiry about Indology was special for their own identity formation as well. The reasons for this have been analyzed by scholars in various ways. There was a romantic interest in the Orient by German scholars. There was also the desire to counter the French influence and the French heritage of the legacy of Greco-Roman traditions. And the Germans tried to bypass this French legacy through building new resources with their affinity to Sanskrit. This was the result that led to the German idea of Bildung and Kultur, which they tried to build up as a result of Indology. We find that the affinity with Indian traditions was also located in the ancient concept of the Germanic Aryan race by Indological scholars in Germany. The strong traditions that linked, according to the German Indologists, the Indian traditions, the Indian languages, especially Sanskrit, with the German language, was something which was focused on by them. In fact, one of the historians who have studied this entire scheme, Valentina Stasche-Rosen, states that almost 128 German Indologists can be located in the late 19th and the early 20th century itself. She states this in her book on German Indologists. As we can understand that in the late 19th century, the idea that Indology and the study of India gained momentum to such an extent that it was placed on the same pedestal as the Greco-Roman civilization. The Sacred Books of the East series, which was edited by Max Müller from the 1870s onward, is one such product of Indological scholarship. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German scholar, also had an abiding interest in Indic traditions, especially of Buddhist traditions. Whereas philologists in the late 18th and the early 19th century had been looking at the comparative philological angle of linguistics as a whole, the scholars of the late 19th century also looked at different other disciplines. For example, anthropologists like Adolphe Pictet, Theodor Porsche, and Karl Penka began analysis of comparative anatomy. And this was the preview that led to the idea of the Aryan race being argued by German scholars. We must also understand that the mature phase of Indological scholarship, which began from the mid-19th century, led to a consolidation of various kinds of scholarship about India, about its historical legacy, about its linguistic legacy, and also its cultural setup. By the 1900s, we find that Sanskrit scholarships were being established and chairs were being established in various American universities also, across America. And we find that Yale, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Chicago, Columbia, and California were some of these universities which began Indological studies from the early 20th century onwards. The second half of the 20th century, the second half of the 19th century also saw the rise of Indological scholarship in Russia. We find Sylvan Levy, S.F. Oldenburg, and V.P. Vasiliev as one of those people who tried to do Indological scholarship in Russia. However, the late 19th century was also a time when Indological scholarship faced a challenge from the occultists and the mystics who tried to build a certain affinity with Indian spiritual traditions. Now, if we look at the Indological scholarship as it had emerged, then we identify that there are also certain criticisms which had been leveled about Indological scholarship. One of the important criticisms which had been raised was the bias towards textual traditions. And this bias towards texts, the bias towards Sanskrit especially, was something which was decried by various critics. We also find that this idea that Indian culture and Indian traditions can be looked at only from within written sources is something which had come to be criticized. Indology produced a romanticized, stereotyped definition of the spiritual culture of India as against the rational and the more material culture of the West. We also find that a criticism was that the Indological scholars tried to essentialize Indian traditions about the spiritual unity and the cultural unity of India. We also find another criticism which had been leveled, which is that the overemphasis on Sanskrit led to an overemphasis on Brahminical traditions. And these Brahminical traditions were some of the ideas which tried to give primacy to race, to varna, to caste, and other such traditions. Indologists have also been criticized by others as giving an idea of India which is static, which is fixed, and which is timeless, that is unchanging. And this has been criticized by others. We also find that many of the Indologists never came to India. So they have been criticized as armchair or closet-based scholars, sitting in their own countries and researching on India only on the basis of the textual traditions. Indology as an indigenous discipline began to emerge from the late 19th century itself. And various Indians who had been associated with the Indian traditions as part of the Western Indological tradition, through their knowledge of Indian traditions, they began to create a new scholarship which was countering, to a certain extent, the ideas which were given out by Western Indologists. Men such as Rajendra Lal Mitra, Ram Raz, Bhaudaji, R.G. Bhandarkar are some of these people who tried to spearhead a new type of scholarship based on Indian traditions from an Indian perspective. We also find others who followed on their footsteps in the late 18th, late 19th, and the early 20th century. Men like R.K. Mukherjee, D.R. Bhandarkar, K.P. Jaiswal, and nationalist leaders such as Aurobindo, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and others. This idea that Indian traditions were not being represented in the correct manner within Western Indology was something which was felt by the Indians. And that is why we find that they tried to create a new idea that Indian traditions were not just located within textual scholarship. Rajendra Lal Mitra and others tried to look at the archaeological remains, at the coins and the numismatic remains, and also the monumental remains of India, and tried to corroborate Indological scholarship from that angle. We also find that after the interwar period, especially in the mid-20th century, and especially the context of post-colonization and the independence of India, led to the creation of the modern idea of Indology. And this modern idea of Indology was far broader, far wider than the type of scholarship that we have in the earlier period. The idea that Indian traditions were located not just within Sanskrit and the high traditions, but also in other languages, for example, Prakrit, and in the regional languages of India in various parts of the subcontinent. And the idea that Indological scholarship should not restrict itself only to the period of the ancient times, but also look at the post-ancient, the medieval, the modern, and the idea that contemporary India also offers a valid area of research is something which was looked at by the Indological scholars in the modern period. So therefore, modern Indology is also trying to break new grounds of taking greater interest in the current scenario and trying to balance the textual traditions with the other kinds of traditions which are available. Indology now actually comprehends not just the sciences the humanistic sciences, but also other type of social, natural, and the technical disciplines as well. And that is why modern Indology includes an idea and study of Indian technology through the ages. Therefore, in conclusion, what we can say is that Indological scholarship is an idea about Indian traditions, the research on Indian traditions, and the way in which it has emerged is a very dynamic, a complex process of interaction between Indian scholars as well as Western scholars. The bias within Western academia has to a certain extent been mitigated by Indian scholarship in the current period. So, Indology still remains an area of importance, and this kind of research needs to be also taken ahead by scholars of our present period. Thank you so much.